Are the Macedonians Serbs or Bulgars? The question is constantly asked and dogmatically answered in Belgrade and Sofia. But the lesson of history is that there is no answer at all. If there are answers, they are decided on purely political grounds.
People were desperate to have recognition by the Americans because historically, America was the only power that did not lie or, in the absence of better word, screw the Macedonians.
Most countries place a greater value on their relationship with the United States than the United States places on its relationship with them. That's a simple matter of geographic and economic reality. The United States is a world power. A country of 2 million, by definition, isn't. So there was no real tension between the U.S. and Macedonia of any kind. The big problem for Macedonia at the beginning was in Greece, and I'm sure you're aware of that problem. And that was a huge obstacle to getting Macedonia integrated into European institutions.
In the beginning, the State Department decided, and the White House said, we're going to recognize all of these republics' independence. So Bosnia was the same as Slovenia, which was the same as Macedonia. What the complicating factor was Greece, and specifically in the case of Washington, it was the Greek Americans. And they were Democrats, and certainly as of January 1993, the Democrats took over the White House. Bill Clinton became president, and the political power of the Greek Americans, they've always hit above their weight, but became that much greater because they are, for the most part, Democrats, and they exercise huge control over the Democratic Party. So they began to throw their considerable weight around, and everything became an obstruction and an impediment to truly normalizing relations in all but name. We just tangibly, and politically, we just could not move beyond the paralysis that the Greeks created.
On recognition, the U.S. doesn't appear to have any official policy on recognition. It's just it just says the president is the one who will recognize a country and will announce the establishment of diplomatic relations later on. And it gives us a lot of leeway as to whether or not the timing is right, or whether we, recognize this country or not. And I learned as a junior officer that there's so many domestic factors that feed into whether or not we move forward.
The name issue had the greatest impact, I believe, on terms of U.S. recognition policy, which is pretty complicated. Greece really put its foot down on the name issue, constitutional issues, symbols, and things like that. And a mistake I think we made was to allow this dispute between two other parties. Actually, it was really a unilateral concern from Greece's point of view. We allowed that to dictate our policy on recognition and the name issue. That slowed everything down, and ultimately it was a very risky policy at a time when Macedonia was under so much pressure. We were not recognizing, and the international community wasn't recognizing. That was kind of perpetuating or exacerbating the pressures that were already on Macedonia.
I went to Greece and met with the Greek, I think it was the deputy foreign minister actually, and pulled out, started talking about Macedonia. And I said, well, that's very interesting, and what a big threat it was. And they had a whole series of pictures, including one of a map showing Macedonia extending down to include Thessaloniki. I said, really? Oh, what's the license plate on that car there in the picture? That looks German. Wasn't this picture taken in Germany? So your evidence of Macedonia's expansionist behavior is that there's this map of Greater Macedonia someplace in Germany. Yes. And then the second thing I said was, let's see, how large is Greece? I don't know, what was it, 8 million at that time? And how large is the Greek army? A couple 100,000. And how large is the Macedonian army? Oh yeah, they don't have one. So, and the country's population is about 2 million. So, I work for the Foreign Relations Committee, and we handle security assistance. And you're telling me, in spite of giving Greece hundreds of millions of dollars in security assistance, you really can't defend yourself against a country of 2 million that doesn't even have an army.
I mean, the overarching challenge to U.S. and recognition of Macedonia and the European Union was Greece's policy toward Macedonia, which was centered on the idea that this country was named Macedonia, which Greece thought was its historical right and heritage, intellectual property, however you want to put it. The leadership that, there's a lot of ironies in international relations. And the irony was that the leadership that was there during most of my time, they could have cared less about that historical thing, but they basically told us multiple times, what else are we going to call ourselves? We were the Republic of Macedonia in Yugoslavia. It would be weird to make up another name. And we spent a lot of time with them, and and indirectly with with our colleagues in Athens, with the State Department, and the the UN representative responsible for trying to negotiate that on different formulations that might satisfy everybody. So that was a big challenge because it was a major domestic political issue for the United States, because the Greeks made their voices known inside the European Union and inside the United States.
This is sort of simplistic to say, but I think we could have tried considerably harder. I think the White House could have said, we're going to buck you on this particular issue. This is not the, we're not going to filter our views of this foreign relationship through U.S. domestic politics. We're just going to, it's imperative that for the sake of stability and in the interest of there not being a spillover or an expansion of the war, we have to stabilize Macedonia. We have to have a normal relationship with them, just the way we do with Slovenia. And you're just going to have to accept it. But as is often the case, the diaspora was even more radical and extreme than the Greek government in Athens. And I saw that firsthand when Froelich and I went down to Athens on consultations during the mission, and we found the government to be, of course, adamant that they weren't going to accept the name, and it was questionable at the time whether they were going to even accept the republic as an equal state. A couple of years after the Macedonia trip, I had helped form an advocacy group of prominent Americans called the Balkan Action Council. But I took a delegation of these prominent Americans to Skopje and then to Athens. And after Skopje, we stopped in Thessaloniki, where the local authorities arranged a dinner and some meetings for us. And as part of the delegation, a member of the delegation was a lady called Pat Darian, who was the first U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights. She had been appointed by Jimmy Carter. And at every meeting we went to throughout that three-city tour, Pat would ask everybody at the table, is this an issue? Is the Macedonia issue something worth going to war over? And when we got to this, and everybody in Skopje said no. And then when we got to Thessaloniki at one of the meetings, somebody on the Greek side had invited over a guy called Chris Spiro, who obviously it's a Greek name. He was the head of the Democratic Party in New Hampshire, quite an important position in terms of U.S. politics. But Chris was in the meeting, and Pat asked the question, and he banged his hand on the table, fist on the table, and said, "Yes, it is worth going to war." So, just a classic case of the diaspora viewing the issue even more importantly than its own homeland's government did.
So in the US, we have a large Greek American population who've been coming for decades, who identify themselves as Greeks, who tend to be more conservative than the Greeks who stayed in Greece, and who follow, Greek foreign policy very closely in many cases, and who have an effective lobby and a lot of representatives in the House of Representatives. They had Senator Paul Sarbanes, who was a Democrat from Maryland, who was in the Senate at the time, and George Stephanopoulos, who also had deep connections to the Greek American diaspora, was one of the closest advisors of President Clinton. So you had all these people who, normally Macedonia was kind of a back burner issue for the State Department because there were so many worse things that were happening in the rest of the former Yugoslav Republic. To get a memo passed or cleared by H was always a big obstacle. They were always very sensitive to the fact that Congress may react allergically to moving forward too quickly on this issue. And if you look back through the Library of Congress, through their archives and type in Macedonia or FYROM, you'll see a lot of resolutions in there where the Congress was objecting constantly to anything we were doing, whether it was recognizing Macedonia or sending troops, peacekeeping troops there, or moving forward with diplomatic relations. They were constantly saying that they were mad about this and that. So that was another actor that I always had to take into consideration.
There is no domestic constituency for Macedonia. There's Slovenes in Ohio. There's Croats. There were Croats and Serbs in certain places. There's no Macedonian constituency, and it's an obscure place for most people. So I'd say its obscurity and the lack of connection was not so much an impediment to recognition as an impediment to spending any money on the relationship. And getting Congress to understand why it mattered.
And their strategy, as I outlined in my paper, was to join everything. To say, the only way this little country can survive is by integrating as much as possible. And they were kept at bay, despite, I think, doing a lot of great things that they should have done. At the same time, as I also quote someone in the paper, it shouldn't be so easy to form a new state. You should have some standards. But the trouble was it seemed to be a moving target a lot of times, what the standards were, because they were politically motivated. And a lot of the politics just in the European Union didn't want, Macedonia or the other Balkan countries to become members. And the Greeks didn't want that either. And that infected both the US and the European Union. I must say, my relationships, we spent a lot of time with the Greek head of his liaison office, traveling to Thessaloniki, talking to leadership there because they had their outpost of their foreign ministry that paid attention to that unnamed country. We had a lot of dialogue, and obviously Matt Nimitz did an awful lot in that regard. It's not to say that all Greeks are evil on this. It's just their politics didn't allow them to take what would have been a stabilizing step much earlier.
We had no formal diplomatic relations for most of my time on the desk. That did not mean, of course, that we weren't in touch with them, but we did not have formal relations. Our relations on the ground were handled both through our embassy in Belgrade, but also by a very gifted junior officer who was a gifted Slavic linguist. His name was Rod Moore, and he lived in a hotel room in Skopje for months on end. And I would be in almost daily phone contact with him to make sure we knew what was going on. And during that time, we had to be very careful that nothing we did indicated that we had diplomatically recognized Macedonia. We had to be careful, but fortunately, there was nothing serious that was going on that required us to take steps to rectify this ambiguous diplomatic position.
The other big deal was sanctions. and the Macedonians desperately needed money. There was money to be made in breaking sanctions. I was offered nearly $1 million to scribble my name on a piece of paper that I was assured someone would be able to use to get oil transported into Serbia. When I said, even if I signed the document, I didn't have the authority to do that. And I was assured that that wouldn't be a problem. In any event, I approached Gligorov and got a meeting with him. And he undertook to seal the border for a month in exchange for me trying to look to see whether or not I could secure any financial assistance from Macedonia to prolong their cooperation. I reported the meeting dutifully back to Washington. Gligorov proved a man of his word. No economic assistance was identified in the 30-day period. And after that period, limited shipments once again started to cross the border. It wasn't wide open, but things did begin to go.
I'd like to think that we could have walked and talked and chewed gum at the same time. And I wish we had taken on the Greeks and just resolved it. I mean, I do think that we would have succeeded in trying to deal with both of these things. And even in dealing with the Greeks, we could have used this as an excuse, a rationalization for them to say, we have to, in light of what's happened in Bosnia, we have to resolve this now. We have to give proper, normal, not special, just normal consideration for the Macedonian state, and let them get on with it. And if we do, they will. They will. They have their own issues to deal with. They've got the Bulgarian issue to deal with too. But let's not throw any more obstacles than there are already enough obstacles in their way without embargoes and without political embargoes and without petulantly insisting on our version of the name. But let's just let them get on with it.
We realized that this lack of diplomatic relationship did not promote stability in the region. So we were at the same time engaging with our Greek colleagues, not the Macedonia desk, but the Greek desk. They were urging Greece to find ways to accommodate and reach some sort of agreement with Macedonia. There were a number of senior advisors at the State Department who had specific focus on this issue, not necessarily 92 to 93, but subsequently as well. And so we were trying to move everybody together to find some sort of accommodation, which they were able to do in 1993, April of 93. So it went from sort of nothing official, but cordial, unofficial relationship to April of 93. We were very anxious to use that occasion to find out more what we could do and establish diplomatic relations as quickly as possible. And we moved to establish a liaison office as quickly as we could.
If the Americans put their foot in Macedonia, then we will be safer. And they were right. History showed that they were right about that.
The key to Macedonia's survival was the fact that the United States did support Macedonia. They did it in all ways that they possibly could without the actual formal recognition. And then also when the peacekeepers were sent to Macedonia, I think Macedonia is the only country where peacekeepers were sent to keep the peace. In other places, they send peacekeepers, but once the fighting starts, and even technically they were United Nations peacekeeping force, but the fact that there were Americans in it, that made a difference. And actually, I remember one of the undersecretaries of the Department of Defense he said, well, how many American soldiers do you want there? I said, one. It's just looking one. I said, the importance is your presence. The presence of the United States there indicates to everyone that the US supports Macedonia.
The transition from Yugoslavia to Macedonia and the establishment was painful. People had a lot of fear, but when the Americans opened the liaison office, it was a relief, even though Germans, Danes, and Brits and Dutch, they recognized Macedonia as Fyrom and opened their respective diplomatic offices maybe several months, if not a whole year earlier. But the arrival of the Americans was welcomed with a sign of relief. When they hired me, they said, you are now in the business of making friends. And that's what we did. We went out and we made friends. I mean, I had a multi-pronged shotgun approach. I had made friends literally from the waiters and petty drug dealers all the way to the president, because that was required and proved useful to me later on when we started doing those, annual reports like the narcotics strategy report and the human rights report, and now we do religious freedom report. All these contacts from the early days came in pretty handy, and also they came in handy in the process of, building an embassy. It is not enough to have diplomats, but when you send a diplomat here, they have to have a desk, they have to have an office and secure office, they have to have a classified office, they have to have all sorts of equipment and stuff. And we started with nothing. It was just walls, windows, a door, floor, and a ceiling, nothing else. And I was thinking to myself, I said, hell, these foreigners, I quit a good job for this. And there was nobody for about 3 or 4 days. And then one day I found a huge State Department desk, which was, and a Xerox machine on top of it. So I spent the day reading the manual. And then came people and they said, now we have to start a mission. And they said, here's some money, go buy stationery. And this teacher of English language and literature got in the car and drove straight home, because I did not know what stationery stands for. So I looked it up in the dictionary. And so I went to the bank and I gave them $4,500 and said, I want this exchanged. And an acquaintance of mine behind the counter, she said, you gotta be stupid. Go exchange it at the black market. You'll get like 6 to 10 times more. And well, I said, it's not my money. And they asked me to exchange it in the bank. So, and I exchanged the money in the bank and I bought stationery. And that's how we started the CSC spillover monitor mission to Skopje. They couldn't say Macedonia because we were recognized as Fyrom and it was complicated. And the first clash of cultures I saw was when we purchased phones, because we couldn't pay before receiving service, and the Macedonian post office couldn't deliver service prior to receiving payment. And that I resolved myself. So I reached down in my pocket and I pulled out 2,000 Deutschmark, I think it was, and I paid for the first 2 numbers of the American embassy in Skopje, 116180, which was the switchboard, and then later on 117103, that was the fax machine. And then we didn't have funds to buy actual phones. So I went home and I found one telephone that my wife found as a gift in a bag of Ariel washing powder. And the first phone call out of the embassy in Skopje was made on that red phone.
It was very, very demanding, because like there was no hard currency wearing. So all the money that the embassy was using was cash. And my colleagues had to go on a weekly basis to Sofia to get cash from their cashier in the embassy.
Then another challenge was, for example, you Americans verify documents with a signature. and it is the European practice, signature and a stamp, and we didn't have a stamp. And in order to have a stamp, you had to be registered as an entity. And we couldn't be registered as an entity because we did not have a designated number, a code in the Ministry of Labor and Social Welfare. So I had to go out and ask a friend of mine to do a stamp for us. And he said, look, I can go to prison for this. I said, no, because I will. So I gave him a Xerox of my personal ID card and a letter from the embassy claiming that we cannot have a code because we're not a commercial entity. We're a diplomatic, and they simply didn't know. And the legislation was still from the days of Yugoslavia. Maybe in Belgrade, there were people that knew how to do that, but in Skopje, we were stuck with me and my network of friends. And that's gradually how we did. When that first chief of mission arrived, Victor Comras, he knew his business. You know, he went to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and he spoke to these guys. I often escorted him as an interpreter, not in the MFA, because there everybody spoke English, but in the other ministries that we needed help from. For example, we needed the designated parking in front of the embassy. So all these things were, we did it trial and error. And thank God the Macedonians were not all that, formal. And yes, a phone call was usually enough.
I will never forget the first 4th of July, because at that time there was, a library or office, and they had the first sort of database with computers. So I had to literally go there and use their contacts to establish some sort of the first guest list for the 4th of July celebration. It was only a few of us, so we had direct contact with the chief of mission all the time. Like, that's not something very common or normal, in other established embassies. You have hierarchy and you have to go through cleared Americans to get to the chief of mission. We didn't have that, establishment. We were like on regular daily basis. I was the only person who was taking care of the agenda of the chief of mission, of all the movements and all the travel and all that stuff.
When I started at the embassy, it kind of grew. I think that when I was hired, probably was the first bigger wave of employees that were hired in that time. Because I remember at least, it was at least 15 of us in the same time. So it was variety of people from the GSO, security, in military, some folks. So it was quite interesting to meet all these new people that were new to the job themselves, because you are entering and then you have basically two people that know what is going on in the embassy. Everybody else is new, so you have to learn. You are actually learning from each other and with each other in that path. Like when I started my first job, I entered, I come to work, and I remember there was foot and mouth disease with animals in that time, with cows. So I'm coming from the faculty of economics, we are all office people and very fancy. And I got to the job and my boss says, okay, so there is a foot and mouth disease. You go and write a cable. And I'm like, okay, what is foot and mouth disease? First, second, what is cable? So how do you write a cable? And then, they explained me what I need to do. And I'm just sitting there looking at the phone and my desk. And I'm like, how do I find out what is foot and mouth disease? And then I was like, okay, animals, it must be Ministry of Agriculture. Let's call Ministry of Agriculture. So I pick up the phone, I dial the operator, and I said, I want to talk to somebody about the foot and mouth disease. Said, oh, you need veterinary department. No problem, we'll connect you. So they put me together through the veterinary department, and I'm calling, I'm saying, I'm from the US Embassy. They start talking. I'm like, stop, please. I'm an economist. This is my first day at work. I have no idea what you're talking about. Can I come there and you explain me actually what I need to understand about this? They say, sure, come over. So that was my first contact with the Macedonian government as a US government employee.
We had a very close-knit, tight community. It was a small embassy. I can remember, not a large number of any of us, we became very close. None of us were, you didn't have the distractions of a big city with a lot of other things to do. And, people didn't tend to travel away that much. So we were together a lot of times at the weekends and for basketball games and things outside afterwards.
This is maybe bizarre, but I really miss the days when we were getting together, the small team of the embassy, and going out for a beer on Fridays. I sort of miss that human aspect of a small embassy.
Things have changed a lot in communication, yes, but also I would say in the quality of people that are getting the jobs in the government jobs. As the private sector has been developing rapidly and the government, the public jobs are becoming less attractive, we see less quality people getting into the job. So when you don't have as efficient and as the groups of people the institutions are growing bigger, there is more bureaucracy involved. Because when there are few people, you know who to call, they know you immediately get the information very quickly, very informal, because you are there's so much work and so little of you that you're rushing to get the things done. You don't worry about the technicalities or formalities. But as the system grows, then you need to be more formal, because there has to be a trace about everything. Some people are just, over time their egos grow and they like to show themselves important. So you have to treat them with a different kind of formalities. But it has also changed within the embassy. As the embassy was growing bigger, then also some of the other things were changing. Not only with technology development, we are getting all these new applications that some of them, instead of making our life easier, are complicating, because you have to file requests for every single thing that you need. And then there are a lot of people coming in that some of them, as we grow older, they are coming younger, and they, being new, they don't have such experience. And sometimes most of the time, they would not trust somebody that comes in for the first time in post. So they need time to develop this relationship, to understand what is going on. And then, I don't know, I guess the world is becoming more complicated. It was much easier back in the times. And I think sometimes that with less people, we managed to do more things faster than we are doing it now. But yeah, I can say that there is a bigger formality now than it was when I started.
When we moved to the building where we are now, again, there was absence of understanding the local culture. For example, they put us all in one room. It is not the labor habit of Macedonians to work with 100 people around them, unless they are working in a textile factory where you have to pass the jeans from one machine to another. But by then the embassy grew so big that there was a department of the embassy talking to what they call the foreign building offices. What I would do differently, I would build a building, in the embassy building, I would make it more humane. Like they teach us, you have to be cautious, not share information, and blah, blah, blah. And Macedonia is such a small country. And when you're scheduling an appointment for your ambassador, at least 15 people hear you. Chances that somebody has a friend or a cousin that's a journalist are great. And then you read in the papers all these online courses about security and how careful you have to be were in vain, because you're simply put in an environment in which security was not easy to maintain.
More and more, the focus was on bilateral relations, and the predominant focus of the American embassy or the liaison office, actually, because the level of the diplomatic relations was on a liaison office level, due to the name issue, of course, between Greece and at that time former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. Actually, at that time it wasn't even former; it was just Republic of Macedonia. The nomination former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia came later with the bilateral agreement, and afterwards the level raised up to ambassadorial level.
I was with Mr. Holbrooke, Ambassador Holbrooke, in Macedonia back in 1995. And we're trying to solve a problem with Greece that Macedonia had. It's known as the interim agreement, where we solved a lot of problems, not all of them. And then toward the end, and since part of the deal was we would send a U.S. ambassador once Greece and Macedonia had calmed things down, toward the end of the discussion, when the Macedonians agreed to go ahead, the Macedonian president, a guy named Kiro Gligorov, said to Ambassador Holbrooke, "One more thing, could you leave Mr. Hill here?" And so Holbrooke says, you want Chris to be the first U.S. ambassador here? And the Macedonian said yes, and so here I am.
From my personal experience in translating in a lot of meetings, I think that President Gligorov was absolutely right to select the U.S. as a key or the strategic, let me put it that way, the strategic supporter of the country's existence.